Welcome to Moonshot Radio, where we stop and take a moment to reflect on the rapid pace of technological change. We meet the people reprogramming our future to explore what's coming, how it's reshaping our world, and what that means for our human experience. I'm Linda Du, a fintech founder, investor, and adventurer, posing the question of what it means to be human and exist in society in the age of technology. Luke Eisman is the founder of Make Sunsets, a company experimenting with solar geoengineering to reflect sunlight and cool the planet. It's a bold and controversial approach to addressing climate change. Luke has launched weather balloons filled with reflected particles into the stratosphere, sparking debate about who gets to control the Earth's thermostat. In this episode, we'll talk about the risks, ethics, and radical urgency that drives people to act on solutions to our planet's existential threats. So firstly, I'd love to hear about what is Make Sunsets and why are you doing it?
So Make Sunsets is on a mission to cool Earth as quickly as we safely can. At a very simple level, Earth is getting far too hot, and it's directly attributable to our CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. I started this because I read some science fiction, specifically Termination Shock by Neil Stephenson, in which a gas station billionaire in Texas builds the biggest gun in the world to shoot sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to fight climate change. As I'm listening to this book, I'd read a bunch of near future sci-fi. It's horribly written, but consistently I have to pause and write down ideas for things to build in the future. It's my favorite genre. Stevenson's one of my favorite authors. And I knew as I'm listening to this book, I'm going to have to research this a lot. This is going to feel like a bit of a rabbit hole I go down. And then I got really confused because the more I learned about it, the more clear it became that there was scientific consensus that we could copy volcanoes by putting up literally the same gas that volcanoes put up when they erupt. We could do it safely. If all scientists agreed there would be, like any intervention, some downsides, that they were far outweighed, like 1000x by the upside of reducing global warming. And I was very confused because in spite of this consensus, no one had done this at all. We have some effects like plane emissions, big diesel engines put up the same chemical, but they do it at a low altitude. Nobody had taken this same chemical and put it into the stratosphere. I bought a couple balloons off of Amazon, a couple $100 of weather balloons, and some powdered sulfur. It's used as a fungicide in gardens, lighter, and a tank of helium, and did it.
Can you tell me a bit about the experimentation process and also what are the clouds like? How long do they last? And what is the scale of cloud needed to make a meaningful impact on temperatures?
Yeah, so I chose this partially because there's not fundamental experimentation to be done. Things that you'll hear people talk about, like cloud seeding or marine cloud brightening. I've talked to a lot of PhDs in cloud physics and other related fields, and they think that clouds are so complicated we may never be able to intervene with them in a way that is consistent and produces the results we want. So for me, things like that, where there's fundamental physicist experimentation that needs to be done, those are not for ignorant entrepreneurs like myself to execute on. When something has scientific consensus about directionality, like when we know an intervention is going to reduce global warming or create more clean energy or anything else like that, to me is when entrepreneurs should get involved and speed up execution. That's the role we're playing. Much to my surprise, we were able to be the first to do it. It was quite, and is still much less controversial, but it was quite controversial at the start, which was interesting to see. I think that anything worth doing is going to be at least a bit controversial. And that we just did this with little initial experimentation I just did with a credit card, no funding at all. That we did this while teams of experts talked about someday maybe doing something is kind of an indictment of them for inaction in the face of what everyone is legitimately telling us, and I agree, is a global climate crisis. If this is a crisis, we need to act. If experts are telling us this is a crisis but not acting, it's understandable why that makes some people upset.
I actually used to live in Dubai where we did a lot of cloud seeding. When it was dry, the reasoning was given that, we need to fill up the water reservoirs. So they'd send planes up, and I think it was silver nitrate that they used, silver iodide. And so they made the clouds heavier, I guess, until they started raining. What is the difference between creating new clouds and seeding existing ones? Why would you choose one over the other?
Yeah, so a pedantic scientist told us technically we're not clouds. Cloud means water vapor. However, most people will talk about clouds of dust or other things. Technically, we're at about twice the elevation of where airplanes fly, so far above. Some clouds occasionally get to the stratosphere, but most do not. We target a release at 20 kilometers or higher. And the silver iodide guys, they're literally putting up particles to create, they call them cloud condensation nuclei, to try to form, and marine cloud brightening does the same thing. They try to get water droplets to form and clouds to form from existing water vapor. What we're doing instead is putting up sulfur dioxide. It reacts and it creates tiny droplets that are reflective in the stratosphere. So it's not creating actual condensation, actual moisture formation. We're just reflecting a little bit of sunlight before it can get to the troposphere, the lower layer of the atmosphere. And that little bit of reflectivity, because the particles are very tiny and the wind's very strong in the stratosphere, they stay up long enough that we're actually able to offset the warming from 1 ton of CO2 for 1 year with every gram of SO2 that we put up there. So it's quite leveraged. We have to do, to your earlier question, we have to do quite a bit of this to have a material difference, and it's very different. It's much better understood than cloud seeding. But because the effects aren't localized, I think that's part of what makes it more controversial.
And then what does regulation look like? So if you were to do this at scale, would that be regulated? Would a country kind of be able to regulate above its airspace? And what does that look like at the moment in terms of, have you started speaking to government agencies to get their feel on it?
Yeah, so it's very strange. And again, kind of like with the scientific consensus and lack of an action around this in general, when I started to dig into regulation, when I started to think this might actually be a business, I was again very confused because it was unclear to me what, if any, regulation there is in the stratosphere. Finally, I got a hold of some friends of friends who used to work at Google on their balloon project, Project Loon. They were doing crazy balloon things. They broke all the records for stratospheric ballooning. They're putting balloons up in coordinated networks to provide connectivity to like middle of nowhere Kenya for months at a time and flying these clusters worldwide and doing all this cool science that no one else had done. They broke all the endurance records for high altitude ballooning. I talked to some of the team who had been there. One of the leads said, yeah, you have to do this stuff on launch. Like you have to have a blinky light, tell the FAA, and maybe a radar reflector if your balloon's big enough. But when you get to the stratosphere, the only other people up there are military. They're all pretending to other countries that they're not there. So they'll just work around you. The more research I did, the more I was convinced he was right. It's actually unresolved in the international law where the top of a country's airspace ends. And it seems to be that people are fine keeping it that way because they all want to fly high altitude things over other countries without telling them.
And then you also mentioned that it's tough to see who should take accountability. How would you imagine the customer demand to look? Who would be a customer who would actually pay to do this? Given that, we see that a massive challenge in climate tech is that no one wants to take responsibility for anything. Is there a certain point at which someone decides that they have to do it?
So when we started this, we thought that we, prototype for a year. I'd focus on technology. I brought on a friend of mine, one of the best salespeople I'd ever met, agreed to join and run sales. We thought he'd get meetings with governments and big companies that already buy carbon credits. I'd prototype. We'd spend a year or so, a couple $100K of the money we had raised to get to something really refined and ready to present it to the world and get data behind it. And about a month into that, MIT Technology Review reached out and said, hey, we're writing about you whether you like it or not. Like, we can include quotes from you in the story or not. So our hand was kind of forced there. We thought that we'd meet with governments, we'd meet with companies, and one of those would make or break our company. We'd get a company or a government and then expand from there. Kind of just to make sure I was following the advice I would have given to hardware startups when I was working at a combinator and when I chat with friends about their startups. We put up a Shopify store with a link to buy cooling credits. I think initially we were $20 per credit. We explained the science behind this. We explained the uncertainty in the exact amount, but the certainty of direction. Much to my surprise, we've had no governments meaningfully engage with us in terms of buying cooling credits. We've had some companies talk, but it hasn't really gotten anywhere. We have 900 individuals who have bought one or more cooling credits. The most has been like $35,000 worth of cooling credits. An individual just had a monthly subscription to. It's largely people realizing that so much of climate tech is not having a meaningful impact compared to the scope of the problem. I think our average customer is probably about 45, 50 years old, worked in technology, has kids or grandkids, and they're starting to think quantitatively about what impact they can have on climate. Most of them just become climate doomers because the problem is gigatons in scope per year. But some really look closely at more out-of-the-box solutions like ours and realize that in terms of ROI, this is by far the best thing we can be doing to directly affect temperature. It's not the only thing we need to do. We need to massively deploy nuclear and many other societal changes. But in terms of something where you can put a dollar in and have a meaningful impact now, this is the best show in town right now.
Even in Europe, where I'm based, there's been a lot of pullback in terms of investments and government sponsorship for climate initiatives. Most obviously, I'm seeing it in the fact that they're removing subsidies for electric vehicles, but also providing grants to climate tech. The EU, which has typically been the leader, is pulling back. And I believe that it is the same or even more pronounced in the US. I'm wondering if your business model now with the cooling credits, if subscribers get a tax break or some kind of financial incentive to that, and whether you're seeing that pulling back with the change in government priorities.
Foremost academic in this field broadly is called solar geoengineering. The guy who kind of really popularized it in the modern era is so against commercialization of this. He insists that if there is any entry even into voluntary carbon credit markets for something like solar geoengineering, if any of the registries that are voluntary, let alone the EU's cap and trade program, like if we get into any of those markets because our cost is so low, he's convinced we'll break global carbon markets. He might be right, and I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I mean, our costs per cooling credit, if people subscribe, we sell one cooling credit, which is a gram of SO2 delivered to the stratosphere for $1. And even at our small scale, it costs us about 15 to 20 cents, depending on the month, to deploy that cooling credit. So like we have almost software-esque margins incrementally. We don't have anywhere near the volume we need. We're about halfway to break even right now. But because this is such an effective measure, if we can get into any of those markets, we will have a meaningful impact on global climate. Right now, we're deploying in response to demand about 175,000 cooling credits, which is, again, a drop in the bucket compared to what we need to do. But in terms of impact this year, the cooling credits we've put up have a comparable impact for this year. And it's a boring caveat, but you have to match the timescales. Like the direct air capture guys who are pulling CO2 out, when they pull CO2 out, it's gone. There's no more warming impact from that CO2 because they precipitate it out or pump it underground. In our case, kind of a blessing and a curse of this is we have to continue putting that SO2 up there. It only has a lifetime of about 2 years. The ton year we talk about rather than tons, if people are funding personally or if they're involved in companies or governments funding climate tech things, I hope that they'll push on that. There have been giant cases of fraud in the voluntary markets. A BBC analysis found that something like 80% of credits on the most legitimate of the voluntary exchanges were entirely fraudulent, meaning that no incremental trees had been planted for those credits. People should be careful what measures they fund. We need pressure on governments and more innovation by entrepreneurs to make this something where it's not like we can't just rely on a couple individuals or a couple thousand individuals for our global temperature controls. Like we need more collective action.
Could you talk me through how the process of launching has evolved? You mentioned your early experiments were on a credit card, and I expect that it's gotten much more sophisticated than that. So how are you able to increase the control and the precision of your launches, and what are you now optimizing for?
What's interesting for us is that the only thing we really care about is we don't want to be too far north. So we don't go much north of here. Part of why I started launches in Mexico. Initial research showed it might be substantially better to be closer to the equator. More updated modeling indicates that we can be as far north as around here and still have as much impact per launch. All we really focus on is making sure that our credits get to the stratosphere. So we want to make sure that our balloons pop above 20 kilometers. If we can't show that with our telemetry, then we don't count the launch. We just redo it before the credits are considered delivered to the customer. Most exciting thing we've built, and it's unclear what value this will have for ancillary uses, hopefully something substantial. It took a long time, but I figured out how to modify really inexpensive little RC foam airplanes to carry our cameras, GPS, and other sensors and fly back to us from the stratosphere after the balloon pops. We've had 2 paid flights with those. One was an advertising one, and we just actually recovered. That was without the plane. A more recent one, we had the plane fly most of the way back. A friend has a company doing weather modeling, and they wanted to get their radiosonde, their weather transponder back after the flight. So we were able to fly that most of the way back for them and recover it.
What do the balloons look like now?
A small one. It's different in color, but it's literally just like a little kid's latex balloon. They're about 1,000 times bigger. So instead of a couple centimeters, it's about 3 meters when it's inflated.
Right.
They biodegrade. Everyone asks us what happens with the balloons after they pop. They biodegrade after 6 to 12 months. These balloons are fine. The Mylar ones are not fine. Don't let those go. These biodegrade quickly. Mylar lasts a long time and has microplastics.
You mentioned before there was some controversy, and I think the really obvious one that I can think of is, why don't we just solve the problem of global warming? I'd be interested to hear the range of public opinions about this. Where do you feel most challenged by the public, and then what would your responses be?
Things are getting really weird in climate tech and in environmental activism and in environmental regulation. I never thought that with Trump ruining most of the governing mechanisms of the US, I never thought that we would be a target of EPA, of the Environmental Protection Agency action under him. And now the administrator of the EPA is tweeting about how he's going to crack down on this startup Make Sunsets. This is surreal. Would not have predicted this, but it's a political problem. It's navigable. We paid a lawyer who used to work there to write a nasty letter in response, and that appears to have gone away. So that was one of the most surprising. I predicted that eventually climate activists would start to realize how dire the environmental catastrophe is and start to support things like this. I thought it would be years away, but to my pleasant surprise, some of the founders of Extinction Rebellion had an interesting essay a year ago called Looking Forward or something, and they call for considering research into geoengineering, which, good for them being ahead of the times. We can't just solve climate. We have to do things to directly control temperature. Calls to cut back are, at the end of the day, calls for the developing world not to have the same things that you and I enjoy. And that's not a morally appropriate position, in my opinion, which is kind of why it hasn't really gone anywhere. People aren't cutting back every year. We emit more greenhouse gases and the problem gets worse.
And I'm going to ask you another question that you probably responded to a million times, but where does the sulfur go?
Yeah, I don't exactly understand the chemistry, but because it's so leveraged in terms of cooling impact, it precipitates out as sulfuric acid. But again, the chemistry is over my head. Even the most skeptical scientists agree that there would not be a material impact on acid rain.
So, another thing that I can think of people having objections to is this idea of us having a God complex, thinking we can control the weather, etc. I'd be interested to hear your views on that, and also if there's any other geoengineering projects that you think are interesting.
Fundamentally, anything that we do in the modern world is geoengineering. We're just, every flight we take, every time we turn a car on, every time we buy a manufactured product, there's a carbon impact. And that's geoengineering. It's going in the wrong direction. That's warming the world. To pretend that we can return to some pristine nature is just not realistic. As relatively privileged, we can put up solar panels and feel better about, and even not disconnect from the grid occasionally. But the rest of the world, which deserves to have as much as we do and has every right to claims on the Earth's resources just like we do, it can't get to where we are without emitting a lot of carbon along the way. So I think any morally defensible argument about how to build a sustainable world, you should be able to answer the question, how do 8 to 10 billion people have as much as you currently have? And if you can't answer that, then I think it's not economically or morally feasible to take that approach.
What kind of scale do you need to achieve? I don't know if you're calculating it in the number of balloon launches you need to do. And if you are relying on cooling credits, how do you achieve the scale that you need to make this something that has a meaningful global impact on the warming of the planet?
Yeah. So the first hurdle for us to get to profitability, not because we particularly care about money, but because that lets us continue indefinitely. Then we can tell our early adopters and their friends who can then become customers that like we're not going anywhere. Right now we have 2 to 3 years of runway left. When that is infinite runway because we are selling enough of something to more than cover our costs profitably, that's like hurdle number one. And that's in terms of volume of cooling credits, the most achievable. We have to be selling about 2.5 to 3 times as many as we currently are to get there. After achieving that, another big landmark will be to break through to where a company or a country buys some number of cooling credits. That will help legitimize us, just like the Frontier and other early corporate purchasers of carbon credits have done for that market. We think there'll be a similar impact for us. What I think is most likely to happen is that a government will do this either with us or on their own. It's not complicated. And you don't need balloons. You can use last generation. Basically, if a plane can go supersonic, then it can go high enough to deploy our credits. We don't care about the speed, but supersonic has to fly really high so that it doesn't overheat from going so fast. Even some MiG jets, certain models can get high enough to do deployments. So we could globally, or one country could declare literal war on global warming and use these same tools of war that they'd use for conventional war to actually fight global warming. I think a country will be, my guess is that a G20 will do this for domestic political benefit, like after a mass wet bulb event kills a bunch of people in some developing G20, the prime minister will do this and then sell it to the rest of the world to continue doing it. The GDP benefit to cut global warming in half compared to the cost, which is in the high single to low double digit of billions of dollars per year, is such that ROI is there for India, for example, domestically, let alone if they can sell continuing to do so to the rest of the world.
Companies as well, you mentioned, have any companies been interested in this? And I'm wondering if there's anything like unintended consequences of creating clouds, because I feel like companies often latch onto something that's not the original intended purpose, but they might see the side effect of this that might be valuable to them.
I consider the climate emergency so dire that strange times have to make for strange bedfellows. I'm not averse to something like even an oil company deciding that, and I've made this argument quite unsuccessfully to several of the venture capital arms at oil companies, that if they know the consequences of mining their proven reserves, those proven reserves which are already valued and on their books, if there's a 1% chance that an Exxon, for example, cannot mine its proven reserves, that is a billions of dollars impact of expected value, right? So if they think that some combination of government regulation and climate activism could mean that their proven reserves become stranded assets, then there's ROI even for an Exxon, similar to my argument for an India. There's ROI for them to create global cooling with deploying SO2 cooling credits, simply to decrease the likelihood that those proven reserves become stranded assets. If climate activism, or even if it stops, if there was any legitimate threat from government or activists to oil companies continuing to pull oil out of the ground that's already on their books and valued in their market value, if there was any legitimate threat to that, then it would be worth those companies solving global warming, because it's so cost effective to do so by deploying solar geoengineering, that simply decreasing the likelihood of government intervention or activist intervention, making their proven reserves stranded assets, would be worth it.
So you're saying that the risk to an oil company in this situation would be that a government would say, look, you're contributing too much to global warming, therefore we'll stop you from using the reserve you've already identified.
Exactly.
Understood.
Unfortunately, neither activists nor governments pose any real threat to oil companies continuing to expand under both administrations in the U.S., Biden and Trump. If that changes, this is where activism and smaller countries can also play a real role. There's an interesting fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that's getting some interest from island nations to more strictly regulate fossil fuels and to treat it really as the weapon with so many destructive properties that in a lot of ways it is.
And then what are some other types of geoengineering? What are some other really frontier things that you've heard of?
Very small group of researchers starting to look at space mirrors, which are super interesting. My buddy Morgan runs something called the Planetary Sunshade Foundation, and they're better than us in almost every way. We can put mirrors in space that are tunable at the Lagrange point where gravity is equal between Earth and Sun, so they stay there. The big way in which they're not as good as what we're doing is startup cost. That's in the trillions. A whole lot of international agreement to get them up there and keep them there. But eventually, somewhere between now and when we have a Dyson sphere harvesting all the energy from our sun, we need to start controlling the temperature of our planet more responsibly and the exact mix of gases in each layer of the atmosphere. And certainly, these are challenges that we'll have to do as we expand to other planets as well.
When it comes to the space mirrors, are they mirrored on one side? Because I assume you wouldn't want it reflecting back to Earth. It's just like mirrored there and then shading.
Yeah, some of them, it's very, very few people working on it, which is crazy when you consider, this is something we could put up to quite precisely control the Earth's temperature while we spend the 500,000 plus years it'll take us to decarbonize at scale. The most interesting version I've heard of is that they'd be semi-transparent LED or LCD panels where you can turn it on and off in pretty fine resolution of this array to make it slightly more, slightly less sunlight that's reaching Earth.
And you mentioned other planets as well. If you're talking about working on the chemistry of the Earth to cool it down and to achieve other things, what other applications do you have in mind for that? Venus is currently toxic gases, so could we make Venus habitable, or what are some other things we could do?
We need to I bristle when I hear opposition to things like visiting Mars, because if you list the challenges to make life sustainable for humanity in a spaceship or on Mars, the overlap between those and what we need to do on Earth is like 99%, including governing systems for people in an interdependent, relatively closed loop ecosystem, how we get people to get along in a situation like that, how we control for variable amounts of solar radiation, how we carefully control temperatures and mix of gases, how we grow food with less work and much more efficiently. Like all of these we need on this planet and any others that we get to.
How did you come to this idea? Because your background, I understand, was in hardware and have a lot of projects going on. I'd be interested to hear what are some of the other projects you've worked on and how did you come to make sunsets among them?
Yeah, I'd worked on a variety of startups, some software stuff mixed in there, which was more to pay the bills than because I was excited about it. The hardware stuff has basically been for personal sustainability. I largely realized that any global impact on climate, that just seems so out of reach. So, done stuff like start a bicycle taxi company for fun in Austin, Texas. After quitting a software job, my first company that went through Y Combinator was a solar-powered, internet-connected gardening sensor because I was tired of killing anything that I tried to grow in my yard. They would let you know when your plants needed more or less sunlight, water, if you do a little with soil, nutrition, but not really well at the time. I had a company building shipping container homes, off-grid little smart houses. So it's been more about personal sustainability, building things that I wanted to see in the world that without decreasing my quality of life, let me have at least a bit less of an impact. This was more just, I was astounded that nobody had done it. So, it's a very speculative startup to be determined if it'll be a sustainable business at all, but it's kind of in the true sense of venture capital where it's incredibly low likelihood of success, but incredibly consequential if it is something like this is planetary infrastructure. This is a down button on the global thermostat.
Do you have VC backing? How did you choose the right people to work with who were willing to take this bet on you?
I'm amazed anytime anybody raises money for anything. I'm horrible at it in general. I think it's not fun to do. And the entrepreneurs that I most like are people who want to be building things, not talking about raising money. So I kind of shy away from it and don't respect it that much in comparison to building things. This really came from me just talking to any friends who would listen and asking them who else I should talk to try to convince me that I shouldn't do this and that this couldn't be a business. I thought it would just be a little open source science project. Like, here's how I put up these balloons. The more I learned about voluntary carbon credits, the more I became convinced that they were largely fraudulent and not having a material impact compared to how much money was flying at them. And really, it was a conversation with a friend with a startup working on a supersonic airplane that really convinced me. He was like, I'm spending a lot of money on questionable quality carbon credits already and still in very early stages. So that really led me to consider that like maybe this actually can be a real business.
And who are you working with on this?
So it's myself and my co-founder, Andrew. We'll probably hire another person focused on sales soon. I hire very slowly because the normal thing for a hardware company is to prototype forever, spend all their money on fancy equipment and prototypes that never lead to an actual final product. We are the opposite extreme. We're trying not to build more than one of something, and we're trying to keep it as duct taped together as we can until there's actual demand to show that, okay, we should invest more time and money in this specific element of the business.
It sounds like a lot could go wrong. Do you have any funny launch stories of things that didn't go quite right?
You have some entanglements with power lines. They're not so fun. I've popped a couple balloons on the ground, which had hydrogen in them. I think Hindenburg is exaggerated in my personal experience. We haven't had any hydrogen explosions or anything like that. Recovery is sometimes fun. We had one with a film crew along with us in a region of Nevada that was more like the deep south than what you think of as California Sierra's Wonderland. Some very angry veterans told us in no uncertain terms that we were not welcome if future balloons landed on their land to try to recover them, to put it mildly. So we got out of there pretty quickly. In general, it's really hard for people to get mad at balloons or even like the remnants of balloons parachuting down because everybody loves balloons. Like during that, the whole balloon scare thing was just kind of comical. They're just fluffy, floating marshmallow things. Nobody can get mad at them.
And then how do you decide where to launch as well? You mentioned at one point you were thinking about Mexico, and then you just mentioned Nevada. So do you always go to Nevada now because of the desert, or?
We usually launch from West Oakland now because we have two different telemetry options. We have a super inexpensive one. If we have a bunch of launches in a month, we'll just put up a $90 sensor and lose it. That's fine. It's just part of the operating cost. Our margins can handle that. And then if we're trying to capture photography or if we want to fly fancier stuff, we'll do our return to home, which lets us launch from, I think the furthest we did was vary, obviously, including in the stratosphere, and they'll be like 100, 150 kilometers per hour in the stratosphere pretty consistently. So if we're lucky, we just have a spiral up and recovery's a short flight or a short parachute ride, but sometimes it'll be like 150, 200 kilometers away. I think our furthest flight back was about 150 kilometers. So it still doesn't work all the time, but it works well enough that we can be pretty flexible about where we launch.
Would you go and collect it if it was 200 kilometers away?
Depends what the payload is. Our first paid flight was to capture some video for a friend's startup of like their little logo and stuff and the curvature of the Earth. We had to do 4 or 5 launches. That was before we had the plane working for return to home. We spent hours trying to find this balloon, including hacking through an island near Sacramento in the river delta. My co-founder got close enough to heat stroke like we were literally with machete, swam to this island, had machetes, and we're trying to find this little package that had an AirTag on it. So we got close enough we could hear it beeping when we, like the literal Apple AirTag, like I'm pressing a button on my phone, the Bluetooth connected AirTag is beeping. So we're within like 30 to 60 feet. And we can't find the thing for hours. My co-founder got close enough to heat stroke. They dropped the machete that he was carrying into the brambles. Eventually, we had to abandon that one. I've had poison ivy on a large proportion of my body from trying to find another valuable recovery. I'm glad that we have the return to home working most of the time now. It's much easier.
How do you measure and quantify impact? Do you work with any researchers or academics to do it, or do you kind of have all the equipment you need on the balloon?
Yeah, so part of why we were able to do this first is because the main researchers trying to do this had insisted that they needed to fly something like 200 kilos of gear to measure the aerosol micro interactions. They wanted to learn a lot more to refine our understanding of how well this works rather than just doing it. So we just rely on the lead researchers in the field, their estimates of impact, and then all that we focus on is getting this done.
And it sounds like you're attracted to big ideas. If you weren't working on this, have any other big ideas come up where you were thinking, oh, if I had time, I'd love to do that?
I really want to see someone do nuclear with like the 30-year-old designs that the U.S. Navy has run for years on submarines and aircraft carriers. They have no documented exposure of enlisted people or general population to radiation. The French reactors default safe, like the opposite of 3 Mile Island or Fukushima, where things just fall out of reaction if anything goes wrong. I think AI compute is this interesting opportunity because usually you need transmission lines, you need real estate near your point of use, right? And you lose a bunch, sometimes 10, 20% on transmission, and you have to deal with building that and getting rights to it for normal things. Like for powering the AC in here, you need a line of copper from wherever the power is being produced. With AI, you need a data connection. Your server farm plus power source can be wherever in the world, and you need a Starlink link to it to saturate. You could probably do, if not a megawatt worth of compute close to that off of the Starlink connection. So it's this unique opportunity to decouple location of energy production from point of use, or from point of consumer use anyway. You still have to have the servers, but those can just be co-located. So I think that could be a cool way. Like if you ignore all the fascist stuff about Trump, and if you take the Department of Energy's new American energy dominance slogan positively, a way we could do that is we could deploy free nuclear with designs that are a generation or two old by parking aircraft carriers and subs and literally running power to shore anywhere in the world that wants it to help them decarbonize overnight. That would be an America that is actually encouraging a very quick energy transition globally.
Yeah. I actually went on a nuclear ice-breaking ship, one of the Russian ones. They just had a reactor on board, but it was old. I think it was more than 30 years old. And then it had this fortified hull so that it could just crash through icebergs. So that was awesome. I live in Germany, and Germany has a similar population size to France, but because France kept nuclear, now Germany actually burns 4 times as much coal as France does.
Burning coal per unit power produced exposes you to more radiation than nuclear power.
Why is that?
Coal's mildly radioactive, and then you're aerosolized. Some amount of it is being aerosolized. If your concern is exposure to radiation, you should fill nuclear rather than coal. As counterintuitive as that sounds.
Yeah, and another thing you mentioned as well was about compute being away from transmission, and a project my friend is working on. He just went through YC, and he'll also be joining the podcast in a couple of episodes. He's shooting data centers in space, and he's sticking the solar panels on them, launching them in space, and the hope is they'll be able to do the compute from there.
Awesome.
What are some other projects that you've seen that you've found interesting?
We're flattered that we have like 900 individuals as customers just because they want to feel better about their impact on the world and do the right thing and encourage our companies and others to do it. We have tools for global coordination and action that we will see used much more. I love the idea of taking the awesome energy of Just Stop Oil and some other activism, coupling it with something like blockchain. And this is all of my friends. I've asked 4 people who work in like actual options and would know why this is a bad idea. They all say it's a bad idea and could never work. But I'm going to take the energy of the GameStop movement and climate activism and use it coupled with crypto to actually be a way to force companies to change by financially incentivizing via holding put options at current prices, people to boycott things, and then use that revenue to encourage more to boycott it, and eventually use that revenue to take over the companies and change their sustainability practices. But I'm told this is not feasible for a variety of reasons.
If a change comes, do you think activist movements are more likely to achieve it? And would it be existing activist movements? You mentioned Extinction Rebellion, but they are quite radical. Would someone like that be able to achieve something, or where do you think the change would come from?
I think our obligation to do low probability, high consequence things is directly proportional to our privilege. The more privilege we have, the more we should do very unlikely to work, but very high impact that does work things towards goals that we care about, defined as broadly as possible. If it's not us building these things, we shouldn't expect them to be built. If anything, we have a disproportionate obligation to try to do so compared to people with less.
I do see an opportunity in blockchain itself, or in DAOs, like decentralized autonomous organizations, because I do see a lot of opportunity in self-organized movements. in science as well. So, for example, I think there's SciDAO that funds psychedelic research, but there's other ones focused purely around like a very specific mission. I'm not sure because I think options is also one step on top of that. But I'm seeing it could be possible. I don't see why you couldn't have a movement, tokenize it, and have a currency around it. And you're able with decentralized finance to do a lot of these, basically everything you can do in traditional banking and quantitative trading. So I don't see why it couldn't work. But I think the main challenge there is education, because it's probably quite hard to find people who are very good at understanding climate as well as very good at understanding crypto trading.
Yeah, it sounds ridiculous and unlikely to work until you look at how well the defense of the attack on GameStop and AMC worked. Like, that's a more difficult. Propping up a company that doesn't justify that value, that's the hard thing to do. Getting a price to go down by people boycotting something is way easier than what people did with GameStop, with all the AI stuff. We have these amazing tools. People are like, we're through the scammy phase of the crypto stuff, hopefully. And we're hopefully starting to be through the everybody being scared of AI phase. Now we're seeing people hopefully step back and be like, okay, we have these tools. We can do globally coordinated, financially incentivized actions, including pre-robust anonymity and difficult to prevent participation on blockchain. Those are really powerful fundamental tools. When people start building with them, not just to, try to make a quick buck off some NFT scam, that'll be really interesting. And when we start to embrace AI more rather than just being like ambiently nervous that it'll get rid of their job that they probably don't like anyways, I think that'll be very interesting too.
Yeah. Even though the world is more connected than it's ever been before, politically it feels very polarized. I don't know if this is just what the media is showing or if the world is actually getting more polarized. I don't think it can be more polarized than it was in 1939, say. But people can self-organize, change affiliation much more quickly, and then people can have different affiliations. And then no two people are ever going to be exactly aligned on values or a way to achieve a mission.
Yeah, I think that it's really easy to feel like it's more polarized now. I'm obsessed with the 60s and how much cooler that generation was than ours. I just finished a book on how the Bohemians led to the beat movement, led to the 60s, led to many elements of modern hippie and other countercultures. Among many things, this book pointed out about what San Francisco used to be like. Like in the 40s, even into the 50s, women would be arrested in San Francisco for wearing blue jeans. We have challenges and divisiveness now, but doing anything interesting used to be really, 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 really hard. And then people don't even know when you end up in jail, right? So not to downplay how divided people can be now, but I think a lot of that is a choice. Hopefully we're on the tail end of everybody deciding they'll just cancel each other and be mad about whatever genocide of the day rather than taking direct action. The unifying thing we could decide is that we're going to, other than straight up making weapons of offensive war, let's just embrace more people making more things more quickly. Like, they don't have to be the same. Some people will make Dungeons and Dragons little 3D printed models. I have no interest in that. Good for them. Have fun. Some people will prototype biochar reactors versus nuclear reactors. We need more people making more positivity around creating things. I hope that can be the unifying theme. I think you see that towards the more extreme left and the more extreme right, at least in America, a desire to leave people alone, whether that's living in alternative communities on the left or them having whatever weird collection of guns on the right. Like, we could decide to just leave each other alone and embrace that we're going to be weird to each other in different ways as a basic American or basic world thing. That might be overly optimistic, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah. And something else you mentioned as well that I think about a lot is how AI just frees up our time. And so what do we do with that spare time? And I'm with you. I would rather just do more things and work on more projects that I found fun but had to shelf. How do we get there? And is it our responsibility to get other people there? I also can't imagine a world where everyone just spends more time on the internet and trolling each other and being mean to each other, So yeah, so how do we create a culture where people are just nicer to each other on the internet?
David Graeber has an awesome book about the guy who wrote Debt, the First 10,000 Years. I think it's called Against Work or Fuck Work or something. And has this quote, him and some sociologist debating, well, yeah, okay, 76% or whatever of Americans say they are actively disengaged with their job, and has all these personal horror stories of people's ridiculous jobs that have no reason to exist, and they know him about working in the job. And at the same time, bemoaning the loss of these jobs. I think in general, we don't know what comes next with progress. If you look back historically, the arguments people made against the printing press or the Jacquard loom sound awfully similar to mechanization of agriculture, awfully similar to what people are saying about AI taking away jobs. What you don't hear very frequently is people who have had to do these jobs complaining, sometimes for fun and for a job, welding. And having something that can automate welding is something that most welders will be very excited to program rather than doing the welding, especially when you're doing the same part over and over, even packaging things. I did a Kickstarter and had 100 units of something to send out that had like 20 parts in it. That gets real dull and real random hand muscle cramping when you have to do 20 parts in a kit times 100. You're doing the same thing all day. And to the degree that we can get computers to do all that, the more of that, the better. And then what's the Graeber quote? His friends like, what are people just going to sit around debating their polyamorous relationship dynamics and gossiping all day? And it's like, yeah, maybe, who knows? People will have no shortage of things to do over time. And I do think that with more time and more resources, more people will spend more time building rather than trolling each other on the internet.
And I would also be interested to hear your take on the role of economics. I am an investor, so I follow the markets daily. And I feel like in climate, something that happened was academics started using the language and the frameworks of economics to describe climate. I'd be interested to hear, is that the right way to think about climate? Are there other ways of framing climate? And then on top of that, when it comes to economics, another worry that I have is that in the past, when there have been step changes in technology, the expectation would be that, okay, we've increased productivity 10x, so we should be able to work half the hours that we used to work. But it's never really worked out like that. It usually ends up being a certain class of people, like corporates, will basically just take the technology, overproduce, and then reduce headcount to capture like even more value. So how does economics play into your story of the future?
Yeah, there's a famous quote from John Maynard Keynes: as society advances and productivity per worker increases, it's entirely reasonable to think, it's not the exact words, but he said something in the 1800s, like, it's entirely reasonable to think that most people will be able to work just a few days per week to provide for all of their needs. It's easy to say that's not true. And then when you look at the lifestyles of our friends, they're working, but they're also traveling the world and doing things that even the wealthiest royalty 50 years, let alone 100 years ago, could barely dream of. And that's our friends who aren't the richest people in the world. I think there is definitely a hedonistic treadmill effect that we hopefully can be more conscious of when you have more. There's this next thing to reach for. It sounds nice that companies will reduce headcount and capture more value. I don't think that's actually true. To get boring in economic theory for a second, the Coase theorem for why firms exist at all. Companies are a way to organize information, and information transaction costs dictate why there's specialization, like why there are law firms specialized in intellectual property versus just one law firm for everything in the world. And that's also why everyone's not a free agent. You can't telegram and be like, I don't know about this Linda lady. How would you evaluate her podcasting skills and wait for a telegram to come back? Information used to be much more difficult to communicate and more uncertain and slower. Now we should have the size of firms rapidly collapsing. If information is 3 clicks to look up our connection to anyone at most, if not faster, and with high reliability, we should have company size collapsing. I think what's dominant over all of this is that we're getting more and more people to post scarcity. We can and will work more if we're excited about what we're doing. But in terms of what we actually have to do to have more than we need to happily survive, we don't need to work nearly as hard as we'll choose to. And that choice versus needing to, like farming because you want to grow a more interesting varietal of something for fun versus subsistence farming, like you're still farming, you're still putting in hours. People are still going to offices for some number of hours, but whether you need to and whether you have that optionality is an important difference.
Mm. I think a lot of it comes down to the concept and the feeling of security. If I'm thinking about economics and how a lot of people are working now. I would argue that many people who are in 9 to 5 jobs don't actually need to be in those jobs, but they like the feeling of security that it gives them. Similarly, my fintech, I do financial modeling for millennials, and we find that like people just don't feel like they're financially well off. But actually, when you do the modeling, it's like, wow, you're actually in a great position. But then there's a lot of comparison with other people. And I feel like a lot of the way society is basically a reflection of its insecurities. So I'm wondering if you agree with it that way. And then I wonder if also the work that you do maybe creates a greater sense of security that enables people to work on other projects.
The most interesting example of this I have, and this was probably 5 years ago now, and I'll never forget it, but I'd started illegal live work warehouse in West Oakland, like a mile west of here. And it was 15,000 square feet, like 35 people had access. I was convinced it was just going to be a noisy shit show and I'd lose all my money that I'd put into it, into the lease. And it was the exact opposite. It felt empty most of the time. People built a lot of art there. Not everyone did. Some people just hung out and drank all day, but like a material amount of interesting art and some startups were built there. After several years of this one guy living there, I'd say hi when I saw him, but he was only there on weekends. He wasn't living there like half of us were. Finally, I was like, what do you do for a job? And this alternative standard of what was cool that we had accidentally created, he hung his head in shame and mumbled that he was a lead React developer at Facebook. Dude was making more money than probably anyone else in the warehouse in a job that South Bay society said was cool. And this was back when Facebook wasn't quite so megalomaniacal. But for his microcosm, that was not the cool standard there. We can change these things and be more proactive about it and more intentional about it than we were. We just lucked into it. But that was so striking to me that this dude who was more financially successful by far than any of us wasn't happy with how cool that was compared to spending more time welding his weird Burning Man projects or building things.
Do you think there is something in Silicon Valley, since you've spent a lot of time in the Bay Area? Do you notice a difference with the way that people think here versus other places? What is it about here that creates so much more innovation and visionary ideas?
I think it's just that people come here to get funding and then the weather's great, so a lot stick around. I think there's a strong correlation between being not born in America and then coming here and being very likely to be a founder, and that is the background. I think you're more likely to be a very gas founder, like a sense of hunger and not being able to just rely on things. I think it was an advantage for me growing up, like 6 or 7 different towns. Like we didn't have the one small town, and like when you don't have a reference group for your entire life, you can't just coast. You have to set some of your own standards. I don't think there's anything. I mean, if anything, here is incredibly expensive and deeply broken in many ways, like trying to build housing or anything here. It's like insanely difficult and insanely expensive. I think that if the US doesn't really get like some federal coherent policy in place that encourages immigration, encourages people to build things, and rewards rather than punishes people going into debt for education. Like, I think India I'm most excited personally about like coming up with some excuse to, I've been to India a bunch. As soon as India starts growing China style, I will be very happy to move there.
My parents are Chinese, and I remember maybe 10, 20 years ago, it felt like China was the next big thing. And there were all these bilateral relations and loads of cross-study programs. And just in the past decade, seeing that dissolve has been really sad for me personally. India is growing very rapidly, especially because they almost skipped. So, China went from, and most countries, when they develop, they go from agriculture to industry and manufacturing to professional services. And India basically skipped the manufacturing and went straight to professional services, and then kind of backtracked and did the manufacturing to get itself the backbone. So I think India's got massive growth potential coming up.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think that as more countries realize that borders to migration are a huge barrier to growth. I read a fascinating set of economic analyses. The consensus is that if there were no borders to human migration, global GDP would double. So we'd have twice as much wealth in the world if we just let people move to where they want to move for work. That's kind of mind-blowing, but also kind of makes sense if you spend any time reading anthropological studies of who's in refugee camps and why. Yeah, it's just this huge, it'll take a while for these things to even out, but now that we have globally transmitted access to information with a bunch of caveats, it's imperfect. And as we have more wealth and as people have more ability to vote with their feet, I think that'll help speed up getting countries to pursue policies that help people rather than just don't.
Yeah, fully on board. So I think we are coming up with the time. So I will ask if you have any final thoughts and if you want a question trigger, what makes you hopeful about the future?
What makes me hopeful? Well, first and foremost, I am very hopeful about the future. Very skeptical about, U.S. in near future. It's not something that's making me proud, nor that has for a long time. But if you zoom out and look at any measure of human progress on the decade plus scale, it's like a really desirable startup growth graph. Every measure is hockey sticking up and to the right. Even things like life expectancy that you would think would move pretty slowly. If you look at those compared to 50, 100 years ago, we have a lot of challenges, but we have more access to tools and a lot of progress that's happened. Yeah, there's no reason to think that will slow down. And it certainly feels better to hope that it'll continue and that you can play a small role in trying to speed it up.
Thank you, Luke Eisman, for this conversation on the urgency to act on behalf of our planet's future. Next week, we'll talk with Leo Kayali, founder of InvoStation, whose flying vehicles seek to redefine transportation and the future of urban life.